All right, so third speaker today is Sarah Mills from the University of Michigan. And so Sarah works in the Graham Sustainability Institute at the University of Michigan. She's also the senior project manager for something called Close Up, Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. And her research considers how energy development impacts rural communities, and in turn, how the state and local policies facilitate or hinder renewable energy development. And in a practical sense, she goes around the state interacting with communities and looking to see in what cases are developments of renewable energy accepted, right, and easy, and where does it get hard. And so thanks Sarah for joining us. We invited you here knowing you knew nothing about nuclear, but that was the point, right? So maybe just simple overview question for you. When you're engaging with these Midwest communities as they're considering adding wind and solar resources, do you see commonalities, meaning successful approaches or unsuccessful approaches that may be lessons that the nuclear developers could use? And this goes to things like size of projects, the local decision-making structures, when you start to engage and how with local leaders. So yeah, any insight you could give us there on the solar deployments that you think would be useful for the nuclear community?
Great. Well, yes, I'll do my best in terms of what this might mean for nuclear. But first, thanks for having me. I'm really honored to be among such esteemed scholars. I am a scholar, but as Todd mentioned, a very applied one, and spend a lot of my time in communities getting their questions and understanding their concerns when they are being asked to host a wind or solar project, and then bringing that back and trying to quantitatively see patterns in which communities are really concerned, are willing hosts or unwilling hosts of this energy infrastructure, and which, see that their community is a good fit for wind and solar. So I will draw upon that and do what I can to kind of translate that for nuclear, but really welcome all of your thoughts about what this might mean. In doing this, I want to acknowledge that there are clearly differences. We're talking about energy infrastructure, but differences between nuclear and renewables. And you may wonder, like, what am I talking about? There's very high support for renewable energy across demographics, across geographies, across the political spectrum. And that's true on paper. But when push comes to shove, when projects are proposed, there is actually quite a bit of contention in many communities. And there are a number of renewable projects that are being rejected. And to be clear, in most states, the decision about siting of those projects isn't, clearly federally regulated. It's often given to local governments to decide. And so this can be really problematic because of the footprint of renewable energy projects. A wind farm can be 100,000 acres. It can span that size. And so often it crosses county boundaries. And so this idea of community acceptance is really important to developers because they've got often not just get one group on board, but multiple local governments on board. So from that work and kind of the some additional research that I've done trying to understand the patterns, I'm going to talk about three different findings from renewable energy and then kind of connect them to what I think it might mean for nuclear energy. I didn't actually prepare this at all. You asked Todd about size of projects, and I've got a project right now trying to understand that. And there is no sense that bigger is worse in people's minds or more contentious. More important, actually, about how a community responds to a wind or solar project is whether or not they think that the proposal fits in their community, in their vision of what that place is all about. So, again, most of my work is in rural areas because that's where there's enough land for siting big wind and solar projects. And what we find is that there's less opposition to wind energy in working landscapes than there is in landscapes where people live for aesthetic reasons. So to a farmer, renewable energy development is just another way to make money off their land. And farming communities tend to be pretty supportive of renewable energy. But it's in communities where people move to enjoy the scenery, maybe in retirement, or maybe it's like a bedroom community on kind of the ex-urban fringe where people live there to enjoy the scenery, but at least prior to COVID, we're commuting to jobs in the city. Those are the communities where wind energy tends to be more contentious because it is a change to the landscape. Modern wind turbines are 500 feet tall. And that change to the landscape, no amount of economic benefit associated with that project or environmental benefit that's promised as a result of that project is going to make up in their minds the change to that landscape. So that's kind of lesson number one, is about the change in the landscape and the fit with the landscape. The second finding that's common throughout kind of understanding community response to renewable energy is that communities really care about the local impacts, positive and negative, rather than the global impacts. And this is where you see the disconnect between people generally saying, yeah, we're in favor of renewables, and then you see responses when it's proposed in their backyards. They often base their decisions largely for especially these large renewable energy projects. It's really an economic proposition to these rural communities. They're generating far more power than they will use locally. Many of the rural communities aren't necessarily hosting this infrastructure for local environmental reasons. This is an economic opportunity in the taxes that are paid and the landowner payments that are made for hosting wind and solar turbines. And so what they really care about is whether, the positives that would come with it outweigh the negatives. And what we found is that over-promising the economic benefits or kind of sweeping the potential negative impacts on tourism or something under the rug is really detrimental in the long term. So as a tangible example, I've studied in depth the number of wind farms specifically in Michigan. And in one, the wind developer was talking about all the jobs in renewable energy. And there are lots, but many of them are in construction. And they're bringing in the special construction crews from outside the community. So once the wind farm is operational, there's not tons. And in that community, the residents were like, this wind farm didn't produce any jobs, even though there were still some ongoing maintenance jobs. In another wind farm community, the wind developer didn't promise jobs at all. They didn't talk about jobs when they were talking to the community about hosting the project. And the couple of operational O&M jobs that ended up coming along with the project were seen as a huge benefit to that community, an unexpected benefit. And so the kind of lesson here again is that focusing on what are the very local, impacts and benefits is really important to communities, and not to oversell the benefits or to undersell the potential negatives that might come. And then the third finding that's really pervasive in the kind of community acceptance literature for renewable energy is that procedural justice really matters in understanding communities' response. So operationally, like what this means when I'm going and talking to communities is that a full range of stakeholders felt like they had a say in shaping the project, and that their concerns were taken seriously. Both, a lot of the literature puts it on the energy developer, which I think is right, so that the energy developer is taking their concerns seriously, but also the local government officials, that they are being listened to by the people that at the end of the day will make the decision about whether the project can be built. Like I said, this is something that's really common in the literature, but one of the things that I and a colleague were able to find is that sense, the attitudes about procedural justice are important, not just in the short term in getting the project built, but they carry over into the future. people don't just learn to live with wind turbines, that how they feel particularly about the fairness of the process shapes how they feel about that project years into the future. And that has really big implications in the wind industry if you want to go back and repower those wind turbines with new technologies. But it's also really important for referrals, where potential host communities will go to the existing wind farms to learn about them. And that's, I think, where this understanding of procedural justice will be really important as you're thinking about deploying new technologies. So in terms of those kind of three findings, again, the things that I see connections to nuclear, but I welcome kind of your questions or observations. In terms of landscape fit, I think advanced nuclear has the benefit over renewables in terms of footprint that it could fit on the footprint of existing or past power plants. These are places that the community has at least very recently seen as a landscape of energy production. And, these are communities, particularly if there was a recent closure where there's an economic hole to fill. I would caution, though, in just assuming that the community always wants that site to be one of energy production. They might have other goals. I mean, I can think of places here in this region where coal or gas plants are closing along, the lake shore or kind of along riverbanks. And, those communities want that they want to activate that shoreline. Or that they want to see, the community might see that old industrial site as an opportunity for environmental remediation to kind of right some of the past environmental harms. The second kind of takeaway about communicating benefits, the local benefits and impacts, and not kind of overselling, is that I would really think about hyperlocal. So effectively, why would a community want advanced nuclear in their backyard? If there's going to be jobs generated, you need to think, and long-term operations jobs generated, that's great, but you also need to think, do they have a program in place in the community college or, based on kind of the existing skills to be able to fill those positions with locals? This is the kind of thing that I think will be really important to set yourself up for success, especially for the first few projects. I think it's going to be really important, not to oversell benefits or kind of undersell what potential impacts could be, to be realistic about those. And then on the procedural justice, I kind of already highlighted this. I think community engagement is going to be really important. This is true when you're deploying any new, especially true when you're deploying a new technology, because all eyes are going to be on that project. And if you want to refer people to the first couple of projects to get other host sites, how people felt, whether they felt like the local government or the energy developer forced this upon a neighborhood that didn't want it, is going to be really important. So making sure that there is kind of widespread community engagement, I think, will set the entire industry up for success.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I think you alluded to this, but I want to connect something you said to something David said about trust being fragile. I mean, have you seen similar things where it's going fine and then developers or operators do something and they lose the community trust?
Yeah, the most vivid example in my mind is it was actually developers following tax law. So how wind, again, for for wind and solar development, the primary benefits are economic. And in Michigan, there's property taxes on wind and solar that go to local governments. And that's an important part of the discussion when communities are deciding how to host them. The state changed the tax table, which reduced the wind developers' tax bills. And the local governments were effectively charging the original higher tax bills, and the wind developer said, no, we don't the state's not making us pay this. We're not going to pay more taxes than we need to, and effectively challenged those tax assessments in court. And it completely poisoned the well. This community felt like, whether it's true or not that the developer asked for a change in the state tax structure, like that they were promised this and that they weren't willing to uphold their end of that the developer promised these taxes and they weren't willing to uphold their end of the bargain, completely poisoned the well. So the state of Michigan extended a transmission line, 5 gigawatts of transmission, 1 gigawatt to a wind area. 1 gigawatt was built, and effectively now there are ordinances that block any new wind development in this place where we have transmission, we have the wind resource, but there's not trust anymore in not just that developer, but the industry in general.
Yeah, David, I see you have a question or a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I wanted to make 2 comments or questions. I guess I'll make comments and then I'll say, what do you think about that? So there'll be a question teed up by what Sarah and John said. The first one is I'm intrigued by this notion of procedural fairness. There's been a lot of work in political philosophy and study regulation around under what circumstances do people actually feel treated fairly, and does that change their behavior, even when the outcomes are adverse? And so I'm just curious as to what we really know about the conditions under which the procedural fairness hypothesis holds true. And the reason I raise that is because I could imagine that if you're developing some advanced nuclear reactor, whatever it is, and you're shopping around for communities to deploy it, you're looking for a place that is, a good place to deploy, has the right tax laws, that kind of stuff. But then you're also looking for a set of political processes, and you're faced with the question of, do you just work through the normal political processes, elected officials and so on, and kind of do it that way, or do you want something that's distinct and separate because your project's special or something? Here's an illustration. There's a community in eastern New Mexico that is siting a interim storage facility, and it's now very controversial in Santa Fe. Everything's controversial in Santa Fe. Less controversial locally for all the reasons that Sarah laid out. It's jobs, a huge number of jobs, but better than zero. And they've been basically engaging with the local elected officials, which is probably the right thing for them to do, but then they've been kind of blindsided to some degree by the other politics at the state level. And so the first comment I wanted to make is this idea of procedural fairness is a chestnut that we all like to believe in, and I mostly believe in it, but I just think it's important for us to think about the conditions under which that's really true. And the other comment I wanted to make is a difference between aviation, I think, if I understand the example there, and citing renewables, or in the extreme, doing something with a nuclear plant, which is, it seems like in the aviation discussion, the debates fundamentally are about regulatory safety and safety of equipment and stuff like that. And I agree with that completely. Whereas for these controversial projects, the process generates its own politics. And that's true in renewable siting. That's really true in nuclear plants, at least in some areas. And so I don't know how to think through this question, but I would think maybe the panel that has convened us, the larger Academy panel, would want to have some opinion about how you set up an community engagement process where the very process then raises the probability of political outcomes that are adverse to the siting, and yet are necessary for all the reasons of procedural fairness. But I've just seen this over and over again on the nuclear side, and I think that's also the story on the renewables side. I'm thinking of Cape Wind, for example. I'm sure this is true for lots of local siting issues, and that would seem to be an area where the Academy ought to have some opinion.
I'll chime in on the procedural fairness. One of the things that's tricky to actually disentangle within the renewable space is that within renewables development, usually, especially in my part of the country, there's a lot of landowners involved. And so this idea of and there's some work out of Jeffrey Jaquette at Ohio State that effectively finds the people who are leaseholders in a wind farm or, oil and gas, leaseholders, they feel like the process was fair because they had more access to the developer, but they're also being paid. And so it's really just a little bit difficult to disentangle that. So I think that you're totally right that the jury is still out how to do this, and it's risky from a lot of developers' perspectives to say oh, let's leave this. Let's go beyond what we need to do, what is required for us statutorily this idea of procedural fairness. I mean, I'm also a planning commissioner, right? Like I sit on the planning commission in the city. And so like this idea of like how much you engage the public, what's required in the books, and what actually leads to happier neighbors is also something that is not unique to energy development or even controversial projects. It's everything. It's multifamily housing, right? And I mean, our regulatory processes haven't caught up with it. Most local siting processes haven't. And there's a lot of discussion about like who pays that expense. From my perspective, like the happiest stories on energy siting throughout the Midwest are the projects where that discussion happened before there was actually a project on the table, where communities decided that they saw wind energy as their economic opportunity. And they said, we're going to, as part of their kind of comprehensive land use plans, we are going to write an ordinance that attracts wind here. They were not even the windiest places. They had, it wasn't awful wind resource, but they weren't the windiest places. But they laid that groundwork. This was like the epitome of like community, like centric energy development. And it was not for a like community solar project. This was 150 megawatt wind project. But effectively, like they set the rules on their own terms and then turned it out to developers and said, come, can you meet this? Where I feel like so many of these siting processes are companies, right? Deciding like, you are the place. Let's try to convince you, like, we've got an idea that we want you to host our project. Like, let's try to convince you. And doing something more participatory, getting it involved outside of like a public hearing process is a step in the right direction, but it's still not that same sense of community ownership in a broadest term of ownership in my mind.
I'll say a couple of words to that, if I may. Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add. I think you're definitely right that civil aviation, most of the debates tend to be around safety, insofar as there are debates. Ancillary debates around things like noise and carbon pollution and stuff like that. But in the larger scheme of things, the civil aviation is blessed relative to sort of energy things, in that everyone kind of agrees that air travel is a nice thing to have, and there aren't an awful lot of options outside of jetliners, right, for that. Whereas energy, I mean, everyone likes to have energy, right, for the most part. But if you don't like nuclear, you can have renewables, and there's always another option. I think that stokes a lot of this kind of debate.
Yeah, Sarah, let me, or actually for the whole panel, let me maybe extend that, and it goes to something that was discussed yesterday. There was a discussion about nuclear developers developing a product, and then, for instance, going into a different country. Right? I think we were talking about Africa, or places with growing energy needs, and that you've already sort of defined what the project is without any community input. And Sarah, I know you've talked to me about this in terms of wind before, but I mean, is there a lesson learned there too in sort of the timing of when you engage, not only on the processing, but the design? And I recall our discussion here was like the height, right? Where you've mentioned to me that windmill developers think height is great, communities may not. Yeah,
well, and that's like there was just something that came out the other day from Department of Energy, like on wind turbines, bigger is better. But generally speaking, I've not heard communities say like, I want taller wind turbines. Like that's not the thing that they're asking for. But where I've heard this work, where I've seen this work, is instead a developer went into a community and said, we want to do a project in this community. We need it, for economics reasons and just the size of the interconnection, like it needs to be 300 megawatts. We can do that with 152 megawatt turbines, and I'm not going to get the math right, 67 3 megawatt turbines, right? Like, here are the trade-offs, right? In terms of the number of landowners involved, in terms of the viewshed impacts. You can see those taller turbines from farther away. So in that way, like more people are impacted, but effectively saying like there are options. you landowners decide what you want, or like you community decide what makes the most sense for you. I think that that's kind of a something in the middle. I mean, what I'd really like to do is have the engineers, the developers, sit at the table and hear community say, like, this is what we want out of a wind project, right? Like, these are our concerns over existing turbines. So, I saw David, though.
Yeah, I just want to build on that. I think, to me, one of the things interesting about really advanced nuclear is that unlike the projects you're talking about, we have no familiarity with these projects. And so we don't know, when it comes to the first, N5 or more, we don't really know what it looks like or what the nature of the trade-offs is. And I think the way you've articulated it, Sarah, is good, is best practices for siting of the things that are difficult to cite. That's the lesson that the industry is learning from the efforts to cite nuclear waste repositories like in Finland and now Canada, which is you work with the community and they get involved in the trade-offs, and you create a deal where people understand the contours of the deal, and then therefore hopefully the deal sticks. Whereas I think when you're working with a new technology, or at least I'll tee this up as a topic that maybe the Academy panel should consider, when you're working with a new technology, you don't know which attributes of the deal for citing the new plant will actually stick when people have familiarity with the plant, because that to me is one of the things we've seen happen over and over again, even with familiar technologies at the San Onofre site, is it seems like you've got a deal that's generating positive benefits for the community and jobs and things like that, and then you don't know everyone who needs to be on board, and the politics themselves are kind of plastic, and they come unglued.
Yeah, let me. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to chime in that I think that that's absolutely right. And there's another energy analogy, and that's solar. I mean, at least in the Midwest, like the scale of solar is shifting so quickly, going from like generally kind of 2 megawatt projects, 5 megawatt projects to things. I mean, there's a 1.3 gigawatt project under development in Indiana right now. That's 12,000 acres. Like, it's difficult for community, like to your point, like, what does that look like? You can't imagine what that looks like or what the impacts will be. And so it's difficult I think, for helping communities think about engagement for something where you can't actually take them to a site to visit. Like, that's really difficult. And so, certainly on the kind of very large scale solar in this environment sense, we're a little bit more advanced. Like, maybe there's things that we can be learning right now from that experience that could carry forward.
Yeah, Sarah, I wanted to follow up something that you said, which suddenly intrigues me. So you talked through this community that on their own decided that they would have a planning discussion, right, about wind, and decide what they want. So, I mean, traditionally when we seed research, we say, hey, researchers, we'll give you X amount of money and you'll build a more efficient reactor design. Like, do we need to make research hey, community, we'll give you X dollars, go through this exercise and tell us what you want? I mean, is there a value to working through those sort of decision-making processes in advance of the technology showing up? Because, you're mentioning by the time the technology shows up, designers have made choices that may not work. Right? Are we sort of not approaching the problem in the right complexity?
I don't know that it's in either or, and maybe like this is because I would hope that it's kind of, funds are more unlimited. Because I think, to David's point, you don't know what you don't know if you can't see it. Like, people don't know how to form an opinion around it, like, or what they're going to care about later. I think that we usually wait too long to do the social science research, though, and wait too long to figure out, like, or draw the analogies. What is this kind of similar to? So as we're thinking right now, like, I'm doing a lot on solar just because that's where there's a lot of applied demand. What 2,000 acres or 12,000 acres of solar panels means for a rural economy, like, we're trying to draw analogies to other kinds of like significant land use shifts, because that's the best that we can do. We don't want to wait for those first projects to be built to figure out then like how people feel about them. Like, we're trying to do some modeling of that now based on the past knowns. So I don't exactly know what you're what your analogies would be, and maybe that's the entire purpose for this panel, is like what are your comps, like what might you be able to draw inferences from. But I think going to communities and getting response earlier on is helpful.
Okay, John, any more comments on that, or David?
Yeah,
I think it's a real. Yeah, okay. No, go ahead.
You get.
I think this is a huge. I think this kind of huge strategic question for which there are no crisp answers, which is how much can you actually usefully do in advance for novel technologies, and what do you think your project is like? Because I think when I talk to people doing advanced nuclear projects, they say our project is like a bridge or something, something intrinsically safe, whatever. And then this goes to work that Ahmed and Mike Ford were on about dread risk. When you actually, if you call this an advanced nuclear plant, just use the word nuclear, members of the public think this is a nuclear plant, not a bridge. And I think that's a real disconnect between the BD folks and the communities.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Yeah, I don't have much specific to add to that directly, but I will sort of comment more broadly. It's my sort of take on a lot of nuclear discourse. Spends an awful lot of time worrying about communication, right? The problem with the reducing problems to the fact that we just haven't communicated it properly to people, right? And I have a couple of issues with that, right? The first being that it automatically assumes that whoever your critics don't have a point, right? So it forecloses a lot of sort of introspection right off the bat, right? And I would argue that in an awful lot of these debates, people often have good points. But sort of beyond that, I'm not sure how helpful it is almost to treat it's in nuclear discourse. There's a lot of sort of talking about people as if they're not completely rational, and I buy that to some extent. We had a whole panel yesterday about the decision theory and stuff like that. But certainly my takeaway from aviation communication is that if you're looking at the actual message, you're sort of looking at the wrong thing on some level, right? The fact that people tend to be more favorable to jetliners than reactors isn't because they are better messengers, I would argue, right? They're often, certainly in the wake of accidents, you get terrible messaging. But I think it's much more useful to sort of treat imagine that people are fairly rational and look at a level deeper than that, right? I think that fundamentally aviation is looked at favorably because it meets a certain sort of implicit sort of social contract, right? I think the unwritten contract of aviation accidents, for instance, just to stick with communication, is firstly that the whoever crashed your plane wasn't doing something egregiously bad or illegal or irresponsible, right? With quite a bit of leeway there. But more importantly, I think the contract says that it's okay if something crashes, kind of. It's just what really should be the cardinal sin in civil aviation is not accidents, it's two accidents for the same reason that could have been corrected, right? And then the third, I think the most important thing is the airplanes fail about as often as we're comfortable with them failing, right? I live in the UK, and British Airlines haven't had a fatal jetliner crash since 1989 in Kegworth, right? That's over 30 years without an accident. And so I think if there was an accident tomorrow, they could really mess up the messaging, and eventually, ultimately they'd be absolutely fine, just because there's underlying reality to how safe aviation is, right? With nuclear things, I think the underlying problem that the nuclear industry sort of skirts around is that the reactors fail far more often than they're supposed to. And we've only had there's 4 100-some reactors. There's 3 meltdowns at Fukushima, meltdown at Chernobyl, the 3 Mile Island, the Fermi reactor, the Windscale in the UK, and all sorts of other things, right? The relative to the implicit promise of how reliable these things, nuclear just doesn't live up to its promise. Treating people as irrational because they then have doubts on the back of that. I think maybe this is the point.
All right, thanks. So I see that some questions are starting to come in from the community, so I'll start to open it up there. I just want to make one comment, David. I've always wondered, to your point about trust and whether people want an advanced nuclear plant near them. I think most people don't really have a sense of what a nuclear plant is. Like, we don't invite them in, right? We don't show them. We don't show how we operate them. It's been very behind the fence. Right. And in the early days, things happened behind the fence that were bad. And, a lot of it was military, but we didn't even tell the communities what was going on. Right. So we built up this lack of trust, and we're not very welcoming. But anyway, so let me shift to Richard Cooper.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks to our panelists. Whoops, get on there. Thanks, Todd. Thanks to our panelists. I really enjoyed this discussion. I have a fairly almost empirical question for Sarah. What did you notice you said there were several communities that did beforehand say, this is what we need, and then they go to the various developers. I assume then some could be, okay, we need this amount. Do we go wind? Do we solar? Combination? Something like that. I don't know. But what differentiated those communities from the communities that didn't take that approach and just were being regularly approached by developers saying, here's a project, yes, no?
The first thing to keep in mind, like the impacts of wind and solar and the community, impact, they're quite different. So this community definitely decided that it wanted wind because it was a farming community and you can farm around it. And it's like farm diversification strategy. Solar is just, at least as practiced here, it's a little bit different than that. What I think is different in terms of a lot of it is, a lot of it's from the political science. It's the policy entrepreneur. It was a local economic development director who said, I am seeing renewable energy development as something that's coming down the pike, and I think this might be relevant for my community. Let's put this as part of the discussion for our master plan. It was also in this case, in one case that I can think of, but not exclusively, a developer who went to a community who said, I'm interested, you guys need to get your stuff sorted out and let me know if, I don't want to waste time and money here if you decide that you're not interested in a wind project. So you guys sort it out and I'll come back. That's the difference. And I've got some work right now to try to understand if this being proactive towards energy development versus reactive, if it makes a difference at the end of the day in terms of community contention or actual approval, right? There's the two different measures, but I don't have the punchline yet. I'm sorry. But we're working on it. And what's really hard in a lot of the, just like I would imagine for nuclear, for wind and solar, a lot of the social science research is kind of case studies, right? And putting it all together, it's just really hard to knit together information from across these different projects. But we now have enough projects that some of that empirical, quantitative, big N studies are starting.
Can I just draw an obvious distinction here, but maybe one that's important for the panel? There's a kind of engagement you do when you've got a project and you're there and it's bolted to the ground and you got to deal with community plus or minus. That's what we've done in this community engagement panel with San Onofre. A lot of these siting issues are the inverse of that. You've got a project and there are lots of communities you can go to, and in effect what you're doing, the this on-spec LNG business began the same way. You're shopping for a community. You're shopping for a place to host your project. And then you're, in effect, getting these different communities to compete with each other on the grounds of their capacity to engage with your project. And we see in oil and gas business that happens a lot, where there's a lot of hydrocarbon underground, but what you're looking for is the marriage of the resource underground with an environment above ground that's not completely toxic to your project and ideally supportive. And that's the marriage that really makes a lot of those projects go forward. And I think for the topic of the panel here, which is the advanced reactors and presumably engagement around siting those first few advanced reactors, it's that logic of having projects and being open to lots of communities and to shopping in a structured way with communities, maybe not using the language of shopping, but that's in effect what you're doing.
Hey, thanks. Mike Cordini.
Thanks, Todd. I guess I was going to ask the question, but David answered it before I could even get there, which is this whole idea of essentially shopping for a site, and then what are the practical steps of consent-based siting once you found a group that is interested in your project. So I wrote down a whole bunch of things from the panel's discussion. One was that some sort of community engagement is definitely necessary, but be careful what you wish for, because it could go awry if you ask for too much engagement. At least that's what I thought I heard. So I guess I wanted to go to each of the panel members and ask the question. So community engagement to me is a necessary thing that has to be done ahead of an energy project. But is it more akin to what David was saying at the very end in terms of essentially saying, I have an energy technology that I want to cite, and what communities are willing to at least consider it, and what are some of the positive and negatives to going through this engagement panel? Or are there more pragmatic, practical steps that have to be done? That's my question.
Anyone want to go first, David?
Maybe first of all, Mike, thank you very much for your help a little more than a year ago as we did this discussion of terrorism-related risks to decommission nuclear plants, and you were enormously helpful to us. Thank you very much. That's an area.
You're very kind. It was an enormous education for me.
That's an area where the panel that I chair has, I think, made a big contribution. We had a big non-classified discussion, as an example, we've done this a few times, around things the community's worried about, and they just had no information and structured knowledge. And we asked people like Mike and several others to come in and help, and it was a big, big benefit. So I think I want to say two things in response to your questions, Mike. First is on what kind of engagement are we talking about? I think there's a kind of engagement when you've got a project that nobody really knows what to think about the project because you've never seen something like this, and you're shopping around for a community. And that engagement, I think the kind of engagement that matters there is figuring out as a project developer, what are the terms around which you want to structure the potential engagements with the different communities, so you can really understand better and systematically what different communities offer to you and vice versa. That's one kind of engagement. I think once you've committed to a community and you've got equipment or you've got capital that is sunk, concrete that is cured, then the nature of the engagement is totally different, because you're no longer shopping around, you are stewarding a relationship. And so it might be helpful to think about actually very different mechanisms. The first mechanism is a kind of structured competition, if you like. And the second mechanism is a structured, ongoing, curated relationship, as it were. And then I think the shorthand you said, which be careful what you wish for, is right. I do think it's one of the things that, maybe this is particular to nuclear, but I think it's to all these highly emotive technologies, that the nature of the engagement is really dynamic. I could not have predicted 7 years ago that the things we would end up spending most of our time on, which are things like perimeter radiation monitoring, effectiveness in fuel downloading procedures, and the defense in depth. I think of those three that we spent, and terrorism, if you like. I think of those four that we spent the bulk of our time in the last 4 or 5 years. I could have predicted defense in depth for the long-term stewardship of the ISFSC, and the rest of them I would not have predicted. So it's just some of this is the politics are just highly dynamic.
Thank you.
I would two comments. I think that how David characterized the be careful what you wish for. Yes, I mean I think that I would not start a community engagement process unless you are willing to like listen to the community. If like if this is something where like you don't ask people questions that you don't want the answers to. But I think in the long, and sometimes what I tell community or developers who ask on the renewable side is that it might mean that a project that has great wind resource and access to transmission doesn't want you. And like, it's better to know that now. You might need to be willing to walk away or change, it might change kind of how you're thinking about the project. I would also say, just in terms of, I appreciate, David, the kind of way you were saying that there's two different levels and, early on, there's kind of structured competition. I would, especially to the extent that some of the early projects are going to be are going to be seen as the examples, right? Like making sure, this is where, especially for first projects, like that there's community engagement and that it's not necessarily a race to the bottom, like that that the project that results is something that people are comfortable with, like that are very, very comfortable with, and that you think would be replicable. And it's not just like that this is one odd community that is willing to host something that looks like this and nobody else would ever. Like that, in my mind, would not be the place where I would want one of my first projects, just because if other communities that you would want to be host your technology can't see themselves in the existing host communities, then I think that that could be problematic.
Thank you. But what you said, I wrote down immediately, which was you need to listen, be honest, and then you may have to be willing to walk away if it doesn't all fit together.
That's my sense. Like,
okay. All right, thank you.
That's easier when you're in the shopping stage.
Yeah, I know.
When you're
I wrote that under
stage.
the shopping category. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, David. But it may be, when you mentioned this transition, right, to the ongoing relationship, right? Once you start pouring concrete, doing that right will make it so you're less likely to have to walk away. Right. So I think what you said was important. John, do you have more on this, on Mike's question?
Again, I'm no expert on engagement, but my sort of broad take on it is that very often I think the engagement, certainly in nuclear, I don't know anything about renewables, but the problem that people are solving for in engagement isn't how do we inform people as transparently and democratically as possible. The problem they're solving for is how do we convince them to take off nuclear reactor, right? And the successful engagement is engagement where people agree to whatever it is you want them to agree. And I think the sort of essential problem that nuclear kind of grapples with in this context is that to the extent that we are completely transparent in our engagement, I don't think many people would choose atomic energy. I mean, it's just if nothing else, it's a very expensive way of generating electricity that so I would argue isn't as safe as or not as nobly as safe as we promised. Maybe we're chasing the wrong things in our engagement efforts.
All right. Question from Ahmed Abdullah.
Yes, thank you, Todd, and thank you to the panel for this wonderful discussion. I've got two questions that kind of I'll throw to David and Sarah. One is, there's been a focus on process in everything you've said, and I'm wondering if that's true of all the concerns that a community raises, or if you need different processes to handle different types of concerns. And I'm thinking especially of the Ontario wind farm debate, where The governments had to grapple with, oh, we don't like the distribution of wealth and the credibility of that kind of mechanism, at the same time as they had to grapple with wind farms cause cancer. And I'm wondering, that strikes me as disingenuous for an expert or wind farm developer to deal with both of those concerns at the same level. I think one is valid and one is slightly less valid. And the second question is to David, is there a political engineering that we could do to make this process uniformly accepted across the industry, given the scale of the energy transition that's required? We're talking about deploying enormous infrastructure in 30 years. How on earth do we get this right? How do we convince CEOs that a credible process will get these technologies deployed faster? Thank you.
So on the first one, the lion's share of the research, right, is on procedural justice, and distributional justice is also part of it. Most of the literature would find that like procedural justice is more important than distributional justice, but like the distribution of benefits is also really important. Like, and there's ongoing work about that. Honestly, this is my in communities where that has led to this think about fit with what the community is all about. I've seen developers, the very same developers, using the same community engagement processes, using the same lease arrangements. You know, they're working in the same context, so like the tax benefits that would accrue to communities are the same, but they are met with very different responses. And so this is what led to this research that's effectively like, can you predict opposition based on landscape characteristics or characteristics of, you know, demographic characteristics or socioeconomic characteristics? And there's some sense that you can. And the things that really show up in that are about kind of what the community is about. It's very, you know, you could survey people and say, are you living here for aesthetic reasons or productive reasons? But like, you can also get that from understanding from the USDA Census of Agriculture, right? Like how, like that sort of information. So that's what we're trying to do. And I mean, the model can be improved, and it's based on just a couple of states right now. But I think I think it rings with the reality that there are some places that are just more predisposed to see a technology as fitting than others, and trying to capture that, not to excuse the procedural justice, not to say like that to say that it's a substitute for it, but to help, if your universe is quite wide of the potential places, help you find those places that are more predisposed. And then you can use your, you know, good development practices. Then I think it's all three.
Let me say three things. First, is just an instinctive point. I also agree. I think the procedural stuff is probably more important than the allocative justice, but there may be a big bias in the literature in that it's easier to see the procedural issues play out nicely where the stakes are lower. And so in some sense, we're testing procedural justice in a different environment from the allocative justice. I just don't know the answer to that, but I just would be cautious there. Second point I want to make is about process here. It seems to me that it's very interesting because you have, on the one hand, sometimes you want community engagement because the engagers are independent. That's what our panel is. And those kinds of systems work well when what you need is independent experts or somebody to help a community understand what's going on, or help a project operator understand what the community cares about. Then the independence really matters. That's an example of that is this workshop we did on terrorism risks to ISFACs that Mike Gordini was part of a year ago in May. And then quite often, though, the engagement process is the exact opposite. Independence is not what you want. If you want the project developer to be producing more jobs or different jobs or whatever it is, the independence is your enemy, because what you want is actually the project developer who's got skin on the game to be there centrally involved with the process, because then they can figure out how to reallocate resources and benefits and reallocate the rents that come from the project and so on. So I think it might be helpful to think about under what circumstances independence is very helpful versus direct engagement. You asked Ahmed about political engineering, and I think the answer is maybe. And one way to think through this might be to think about the different kinds of engagement problems or political problems. So we've been talking a lot about citing today. Then there's quite distinct from that are the issues about stewardship of an existing site, which is a different kind of engagement problem. Different yet again is what a lot of people think will be one of the roles for these advanced reactors, which is to help with integration of renewables. So there, it's a different kind of engagement where you're trying to engage with the people who are involved in tariff design and compensation for capacity and clean firm power and that whole discussion, which is a different kind of engagement altogether. I do think there's an insight that comes from the people who study the politics of highly contested technologies and contested processes, which is the politics are dynamic. In the early days, everything seemed hard because the technology is unfamiliar and your interest groups that favor the technology are fragile. And then what happens is as the technology scales, and it's not just a matter of familiarity, but frankly, it's also a matter of generating benefits to organized labor and a bunch of other very well-organized, politically well-organized groups, then the politics become more permissive over time because the dynamism that's created by amplifying the political power of the groups that want the project to work.
All right, thanks. John, any comments?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my internet's been sort of freezing up. So at this point, I'm barely aware of what the topic is for the last 5 minutes, I'm afraid. So I'm going to bow out of this one.
All right. Well, we did ask you and your internet to stay up late where you live, right? So it's not an unanticipated challenge. Right? All right. So I think I don't see any more questions from the committee. We're also within a minute of when we said we'd finish. I want to thank the panelists. This has been great. Very insightful, sort of practical, on-the-ground knowledge. Appreciate it. Let me ask if our chairman, Dick Meserve, has anything to add before we close, and then Kasia, if you have any final words.
Well, I just want to join you in thanking the panelists for having provided us both an interesting conversation this morning and this afternoon. It's been very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, Kasia, any organizational closing comments?
Yeah, no, I echo what you and Dick already said. Thank you to the panel.